like to welcome all of you here, and I'm really happy that I'm very happy that you're here. And most of the books, or all of the books, the 5 books which are being launched today, and this being the 3rd one, is all about Bangkok, and Bangkok before, Bangkok afterwards, and in the future. So if you stay here, as I was told, and I have learned since this morning, if you stay here and you look and listen to all of the launches, of the book launches, you will see that you'll hear and find out a lot about Bangkok, what it was, and what it's become, and what it might become. So I have the great pleasure of introducing Claire Keefe-Fox, who has written her fifth book, and which is, you have it up there, Bangkok in Times of War, Love and War, War and Love, Love and War, which takes place during the Second World War in Bangkok, mostly in Bangkok, and some in Burma, and some in India. I won't go into more of it. I would like to give you the floor so that you can explain your book way better than I can. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, hello everybody. I'm very, very pleased that you made the time to come. I see many dear faces here, but also new friends. So once again, thank you for being here. The book is a sort of saga, and I say a sort of saga because there is, as often in my books, there is a book within a book. And the way it started is that I was intrigued by the story of the Prime Minister of Thailand, Pibun Songkram, and his Minister of Finance, Pri Banomyong, who were actually friends and kind of revolutionaries in Paris in the late 20s, and they began to learn about the various political systems and wanted to develop one for their own nation. And they were at the origin of the revolution of 1932, and as I'm French, I thought it was very fitting that it should start in France. But then I realized that much as I would have wanted it to be a novel, I couldn't do it. I had no feel for the characters. They were wooden. And so I decided to nonetheless include that in my book, but actually attribute the authorship of this book I was unable to write to somebody else who was trying to write it. And he became one of the main characters in my book, Lawrence Gallet. And for those of you who have read Siamese Tears, he is actually the kind of author of Siamese Tears. It is the story, Siamese Tears story of his grandmother, and which explains his affinity for Siam, which then becomes Thailand. And it is at a time where the world is changing. The world has already changed quite a bit since World War I, and it is in a state of upheaval with Europe on the eve of World War II, where unspeakable horrors were happening, where nationalisms were on the rise everywhere, and that might remind you of the present situation. And I thought it was an interesting period because, try as I might, I found very few novels devoted to World War II from an Asian perspective. If anything happens in Asia, it's always peripheral. Somebody ends up there, but very, very little is devoted to what actually happens. And as far as I could tell, nothing had been written, no fiction had been written about what it was like to live in Bangkok during World War II, and particularly after the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. So that was the way I wanted to approach it. So I have these characters who are living through war. And for me, my sense of history has always been that history is intensely personal. You may have, your history is not the same as my history. They're often very much alike. but every person lives through world events in a different way. I am sure that if we were to describe, for instance, our reaction to 9/11, we'd all have rather different reactions. And it's all those individual stories put together that make for the large thrust of history. But I wanted to talk about events seen in a very personal way, how each person lived through it. And my two characters, Laurence Gallet, who is a journalist, a writer, a would-be writer and a journalist, and who is then swept off in the war and just gradually travels through Burma and India and China, and the story of the female character who is an American nurse who is stuck in Bangkok and lives in quasi-hiding because she's an enemy alien. So it's always in a parallel. There is always one chapter devoted to what is happening in the rest of Asia, following one of the characters, and the other chapter is extremely claustrophobic in a way. It follows what it's like to live in Bangkok at that time. Any questions?
I do have questions. I understand now why you chose that in that time, etc. I was just wondering if there was a reason for the nationality of the people.
No, I mean, it's very rare that I don't have a French person in my books, but in this case, there's no. Well, he's a bit. Laurence Gallet is half French, but does not live in France. The nurse is American from Boston, which is a kind of culture that I'm rather familiar with. But it was also I wanted them, as a rule, to be Westerners because I do not feel that I can, in all honesty, write about the feelings of, for instance, a Siamese or a Thai person. It is a cultural DNA that I don't have. So I can write it from the outside, what I believe, but there is never there's never a stream of consciousness of a Thai person. It's always a description from the outside. However, I can attribute feelings and reactions much more easily to Westerners. I mean, I have the viewpoint of a Farang, and I keep the viewpoint of a Farang.
When you were researching about the Japanese occupation of Bangkok and of Thailand, did you come across any things that you didn't know about?
I came across a lot of things that I did not know about. That is the beauty of doing research, because when you research, it's actually browsing. You look for one newspaper article, and that leads you to another. I found some quite extraordinary things about. The thing is, it was not a Japanese occupation. It was sometimes seen as such, but one mustn't forget that the government of what was then Thailand, it had changed its name from Siam to Thailand before it was going to revert to Siam and then back to Thailand. But at the time, the government of Prime Minister Pibu Samkram was an ally of the Japanese. So it was not occupation. It was not collaboration. It was basically keeping a low profile, I think, would be one of the best ways of putting it.
Well, I'll go back to this because I think that what you had an insinuation. Yes, you do write that they were invited there and then they were here, but you do insinuate that the general population was not happy about that and that they were very unhappy about that.
Well, they weren't. At first, I mean, I think the attitude of the population changed. There was, at first, the whole nationalistic attitude which existed. And there was the revenge of the Asian man against the white colonizing man, although Siam had never been colonized, but there was the creation of pride to be Asian strong, and also the fact that the Thai army was one of the strongest, except for Japan, was one of the strongest in Southeast Asia, not counting the British, but, and even considering that the British forces had been considerably depleted because of the war in Europe and had been sent to Europe to assist, the Thai army was very, very strong. And there was a creation, this pride to be Thai, and also the revenge against the French, who had colonized part of their territories, and it still rankled, and also against the British, who had also colonized part of their territories. And Siam remained independent, but certainly amputated of a sizable part of its territory.
I was also surprised by the description of the expats or the British, et cetera, and they are how colonial they are, and they're stuck in their ways, et cetera, compared to maybe Galais, who's a little bit more broad-minded, et cetera, and who is more accepting of Asia. Could you please expand on that?
Well, I think they were. I think possibly the expats, people who had lived there, were the product of the thinking of their time. If you read any novel set in India before partition, or in Burma, if you read Orwell, take Orwell for instance, the way he stigmatizes the attitude of the British, or the French vis-a-vis the Indo-Chinese colonies. And of course, the people who arrived from the outside, intellectual artists, were shocked and had a completely different view, also because of the seduction amongst intellectual circles of Orientalism, and attributing to the East a glamour which was felt in the West, but people who were living in India, Siam, or Indochina, or Burma really did not feel. And it was also, it's a form of insecurity, the way, the feeling of superiority. I mean, just have to impose yourself.
But you just expose that to your own characters, to your fictional characters, who are much more accepting of the country, who are much more...
Because they're new arrivals.
They're new arrivals.
They're new arrivals. I'd like to think that if they were to stay, they would not turn into pompous expatriates, and I hope they wouldn't, but I don't know.
Well, okay, I have one other question. What is the audience that you're trying to reach? Sorry, what is the audience that you're trying to reach with your books?
People who like a good story. I think I've always said that I write the books that I would like to read and don't exist. So basically, it's for people like me who are very much interested in Asia and in history, and I admit it's a bit of a cheating way of teaching history. Mm-hmm. A lot of people, I know that in fact that has happened with the Thai translation of my books. I mean, I managed to get people to know more about their history in a very soft and underhanded way.
I was very surprised that you also kill a lot of your major characters.
I kill my characters.
Well, I mean, some of the very interesting characters. I mean, I find that the doctor, the Japanese-American doctor, is a very good example, and you really destroy him very badly, terribly.
Well, the thing is, the periods that I write about are never periods of quiet. There are always upheavals in the world, and you know, in World War II, a lot of people died. You know, so it was, and some of these characters, for the good of the story, need to disappear. For instance, this one of the character that you mentioned, and a lot of the characters. Something that I would like to say also, and is that when you read the book and that you find that some of the characters are practically unbelievable, that they're completely over the top, those are the ones who really existed, and they were exactly like that. I think war, besides opening the way for a very dark side of all men, and I say men more than women, but I think all men, but some women also, no doubt. But it also does away with the rules. And people can let themselves be as crazy as they want. And you will find when you read the book that there are some people whose career is absolutely amazing. And if you look them up, you'll find out that those are the ones I really made up nothing about. There's some astonishing journalists. For those of you who know of the Flying Tigers, General Claire Chennault and General Stilwell, and also there was a British colonel, yes, he was a colonel, maybe major, can't remember, who basically fought naked with an onion tied from a string around his neck. It's true. I didn't make, there's nothing that you can make up about. And also the astonishing, it was also the possibility for me to learn about, first of all, the extraordinary role of the press in the war. And press correspondence in World War I played a fairly minimal role, but World War II, and more so obviously afterwards to the Vietnam War, were quite remarkable in terms of bravery, in terms of neutrality, in terms of constantly trying to break the rules to get a better story. And I think, if anything, those, for me, they're the real heroes. It's the press correspondents. And unfortunately now, there's far less, there still is that, but far less, because war is completely different than it was in those times. It is more insidious and more removed.
Well, I mean, you do talk about the fact that some of them were obliged to write things which were positive, etc., a little bit like our fake news today, in a way that...
Except what they also say is that they all kept their notes and they published books afterwards. They corrected. And they all say they had book contracts lined up and told the real story afterwards, which is a very insidious, it's a great way of taking revenge, because books remain, whereas newspapers, they wrap yesterday's fish.
I was very intrigued by your American-Japanese surgeon. I thought that, you know, he was in such a difficult space and place that maybe you're right to kill him off, because it's such a dichotomy between being a Japanese, being an American, being enlisted, or was in Japan and was enlisted in the army, and was not liked by the Japanese, etc. So he's a very, very intriguing character. Could you please talk about him?
Yes. Well, I think it is the case that happens. I think it's always difficult to be a transplant. And this is something that I have felt myself. I am half French, half American. but more French. But I spent my childhood in the States and then was transplanted to France and lost my American persona friends. And it's difficult because there's always part of you that wants to be back, but there's also part of you that tries to adapt, but you never really fit in. And it's comfortable in some ways, when in times of peace, to be able to yo-yo between two cultures. But in times of war, and I'm very fortunate because my two countries so far have been at peace, but I really wonder what would happen if they were to be at war. I mean, where would my loyalties go? I don't know. And I think that in times of war, it's difficult. You try and remain apart, but you cannot. And I think in the case of this character, he was losing his battle from the very beginning.
Could you also talk about a little bit about Kate, because she starts as a very, very innocent woman, and she becomes this one very pragmatic, very strong, and who is able to overcome immense upheavals in her life.
Well, Kate, who is the main female character, is a nurse from a rather poor background from South Boston, Catholic, and who comes to Thailand, to Siam at the time she arrives, as a maternity nurse, basically to get over a broken heart and also to leave her, well, the fact that she was practically the only 25-year-old woman in Boston who was not married. So she leaves, and therefore she is innocent. She knows nothing except Boston, and she arrives in a country which has been described to her as a beautiful exotic country with a very comfortable, and she finds herself in a country working in a charity hospital, receiving a very large number of Chinese refugees from the war in China, and doesn't really get much chance to find the country very glamorous, because she was poor and she remains poor. And she, when the war breaks out, is forced to acquire a different identity and to hide, but still continue to work because she has no choice, and becomes possibly a bit hard, possibly because she's frightened, and tries to, I mean, she's a survivor. She is the daughter of immigrants and has kept that pragmatic, survival-oriented attitude.
I think that all of your characters are survivors in there, because basically during wartime you do become pragmatic, and you become everything else, all your maybe moral beliefs kind of are peeled off, and your pragmatism takes over. Practically all your characters are very pragmatic during the war, no? Affected by the war.
And those who aren't die.
No, but the Thai doctor, I really miss the Thai doctor, because he sacrificed himself so much, and you killed him.
Well, yeah, but he wasn't a survivor. Yep, I told you.
I don't know if do you have any other things to add, or would you like to open up the floor for questions?
Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
Yeah.
Well, you spent a lot of time talking about war and very little time talking about love. And I'd like to hear the love part.
Well, love is what enables them to keep on going, basically. It's love and hope. And, well, it's, read the book. I don't want to give the story away. No spoilers. But basically, there is a love story, and that's what enables them to constantly, not give in to the temptation of giving up. They hope that they are going to be able to see each other again and to overcome, but which is the case, I believe, for so many people in times of war. You are tossed by the currents of war into various places, and you constantly try to come back and try to meet up again, and often, unfortunately, it's not possible for too many, but in some cases it was. So that's the war, the love is what enabled them to survive the war.
Hi. I personally love learning history through historical novels, and I loved your previous ones too. I was wondering, what were your sources of reference, and how loyal were you to historical facts? And the third question, if I may, how long did it take you to write the book?
The book took 3.5 years. The sources, it's great writing about anything that happened in the 20th century because there are countless archives that you can find, many of them you can find online. I have made up no event. All of the events that I described happened the way they happened. And what's extraordinary is their newspaper archives. If you go on, for instance, if you look on the New York Times, New Straits Times, the Times of London, sometimes you have to pay a little bit to be able to consult their archives, but it's amazing what you can find there. So that's one of the main things. Also, those famous books that I was telling you about, the war correspondents who took revenge by writing what really happened, they published their books and they're there. So I also use that. Some of them were perhaps a little bit slanted. But most of them were just very matter of fact. And yeah, I mean, and libraries. Libraries are my favorite places in the world. I love libraries, and there's lots that you can get in libraries. So yes, 3.5 years, but all of it is absolute fact. Just a few characters, the characters are there to enable you to bring you forward, and also to make the facts not seem so dry.
Hi. So when you look at Thailand today, like with this political climate and all, what can we learn from your book?
That's a very tricky question. I think that what to learn, you need to know history. I think that is, I think this is the lesson. And it's been attributed to Napoleon, it's been attributed to Churchill, and to I don't know who else. Those who do not know history are condemned to repeat it over and over. So that, I think definitely you need to know history. And to remember, yes, remember how fragile democracy is. Any more questions?
I'm afraid the microphone can't reach you.
So, I'm interested in the Free Thai movement. Did you involve them in your book at all?
Yes.
Oh, good.
Yes.
And the plot or the plan to invade Thailand that was shortcut by the bombing of Hiroshima. Did you take it up through that time period? Through September of 1945?
The book ends more or less in September of 1945. Okay. So that, everything, that's also some of the extraordinary stories, things that you find out in people who are parachuted and they're not able to rejoin the meeting place quite simply because they break an ankle. The thrusts, the big waves of history that are undermined by these silly things like a sprained ankle. But that happens. No penicillin. Yes, I'm not giving a spoiler, but they discover penicillin in my book. they don't discover the creation of penicillin, but they're given penicillin and they realize how miraculous it is. Any more questions?
Is that true? That was true. They had discovered they were given penicillin.
They used penicillin for the first time, and it's actually the Thai had no penicillin, and it was actually the Japanese, who first gave them the penicillin they used in hospitals. Yeah. Penicillin was hardly ever used until 1943, and everything, and the war was already going badly for the Japanese, which meant that ships were not able to carry goods from Japan to Thailand, and Thailand was completely isolated by the Western allies. And the oceans were extremely dangerous for both sides, for the ships of both sides. So even if they had been sending goods over, the odds were that the ship would be sunk. It was, if anything, well, the war in Burma was an absolute massacre, but afterwards, the worst was the seas. I mean, the seas and the Philippines, but basically the marine battles, naval battles were incredibly deadly. Are there any more questions? Yes?
Hi there. I'm very interested in this process of creating a historical novel, and I'm really curious how much, for example, do you first need to be on top of the historical context, having done all your research, and then the characters and the story flow, or is it a more sort of iterative process?
Well, it's iterative, and also I have to say that my father was an officer in World War II. So I grew up with war stories. I grew up with war films. There was always something about the war, and in fact, now that my mother, who is 98, the only thing she reads about now is World War II, and we actually tease her in telling her that nothing interesting has happened in the world since World War II. So there's that. But so, you know the broad outlines, and you create your characters, and then you choose facts, the facts that would impact your characters. But it is iterative, but you know the broad outlines. But some people, some actual people who lived, you discover, and that's really nice, is that you actually are able to bring them into your story. You can manipulate General Stilwell or Marie Curie's daughter and bring them in, and it's really nice, and nobody will stop you. So that's one of the great things. Are there any other questions?
The arrangement that the Thais had with the Japanese was in fact to remain neutral and, most importantly, not to become colonized. And you say that the Thais' relationship towards the Japanese was neutral. That I'm wondering if they were aware, and whether you touch upon it in your book, of the labor camps in the Kwai Bridge, for example, and what was going on there and how they felt towards that.
I think they felt shame. I think it is something that has not entirely been processed. I would have to ask our Thai friends here, but I really think it has not been entirely processed. But I think also that it was wrapped up in this kind of overall resentment of resentment and perhaps also the realization that they thought they were strong on a par with the Japanese, but realized they weren't really. So I think all that was a difficult way of adjusting to reality. But there was resentment against the Japanese, but one mustn't forget the resentment against the Western powers that had been bred into them since 1906, and even later, and since 1910, because of the colonizers. And it's something that they were taught in school, and not only that they were taught in school, but it's something that was drummed into them constantly throughout the 20s and the 30s. It's difficult to imagine now being told that such a group of persons are your enemies. I just cannot imagine for 20 years being told that you have countries that have despoiled you. But it was part of the official policy. And it's difficult to, and in fact, the character, my main character, Laurence Gallet, realized that he cannot reconcile the official policy with these extremely charming people. Are there any other questions?
No. So I take your microphone, and thank you very much. And thank you very much for all of you who have come, and thank you. I've read your book, and I really loved it. And it really reads very, very clearly and very fast, and it's I think it's a turn pager. Even though it's a saga and it's a war and everything, but I read it with great pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming, and I hope you like the book.
A little bit of an administrative announcement. The rooms are going to be swapped around. The very Bangkok is going to be in the next door room at 6:30. So if you're going to that, we're next door. Yeah.